Einen schönen guten Morgen allseits.
Good morning to everyone. Welcome to the countryside.
Ich freue mich, dass wieder so viele der Diskussion.
I'm glad that so many are following these discussions. I am overwhelmed how many people, how many contributions, how many examples we've heard. Among them, by the way, during the last 2 days, always some elements about the rural area. And now we have the time to go more into detail here in the time allotted to this program. I am sitting in Thuringia here in Germany. Apolda is a small town with a long tradition of manufacturing bells. So maybe the bells in your church are from Apolda. For example, in the Cologne Cathedral, there are bells which were molded here. So we are internationally connected. And I think it is great that we can have these kinds of connections. I am your chair for today, for this session, your moderator. And I have bad news. If you remember the early stages of the program, you will know the name of Jakobine Gelderloos, and you can still find it in previous versions of the program. She has sadly fallen ill, so she will not be able to have a presentation today, but we have EDITH WOUTERS. The good news is that it means we have more time, which is why I would like to ask the co-chair, Kerstin Gothe, to nevertheless watch over the time we still have, so that we can have a fruitful discussion. I am MARTA ländlichen. I am the leader of the International Building Exhibition in Thuringia, and this is this perspective which I will present to you today. An introduction into our discussion. And you will soon see that we are talking about the rural area here. So I will begin now with the screen sharing. I hope you can all see this. So church and more than church. Then we can continue. This figure ground diagram of the state of Thuringia shows you how dense, how fragmented the settlement structure is. I want to make clear to you here with this that it is truly a rural area. Every black dot here is a village, a settlement. Many of them are have historic village centers. Thuringia is truly a rich, fruitful cultural landscape. A short overview over the inventory of churches from just the evangelical church. It demonstrates this as well. We have around 2,000 evangelical churches or Protestant churches. You can see in the statistics how much this is, how many churches there are compared to the rest of Germany. We have 20% of all churches of the evangelical church in Germany, but only 3.3% of church members, of congregation members. And even they do not go to Mass every Sunday, of course. So around 2,000 churches. If we continue, you can see that on average, though, that means 187 members of the congregation per church, and 99% of churches are historic and are listed as monuments. In our process, we learned that nobody, truly nobody, would imagine demolishing these churches. So the churches are not only anchored in the Protestant congregations, but generally in the population. In spite of the efforts made, many church buildings have high repair requirements. Here, for example, the St. Anne Chapel in Kobitz. Please remember this image because I will come back to this example. Almost 100 years ago, the last baptism took place here. The small sacral space of this chapel resembled a storage space with broken equipment and the floor. You can see the state here. The evangelical church in central Germany itself asked itself, when we started the International Building Exhibition in 2014, giving up, selling, or transforming these churches. What do we do with these churches? Real estate, from a real estate standpoint, it's a portfolio which is too big for the need. Spoken from a spatial, structural perspective, it is a phenomenon and a problem that you have small parish churches in the rural areas and that you have these pastoral structures. Because, of course, the service has to take place and the welfare work has to take place. One village, 200 inhabitants and 2 churches is a common sight in Thuringia. So there is an opulent offer, a rich building, a treasure of buildings. So given these questions, the evangelical church called for ideas. What do we want to do with these many churches? By the way, the vacancy in these buildings for us, the International Building Exhibition in Thuringia, was an example for the vacancy everywhere. There are empty farmers' houses, factories, school buildings, shopping malls, etc. And a journalist in one of these discussions called the situation of the churches as the top of the iceberg. So the peak, maybe the most important category of this vacancy, but it is a question we have on many levels in Thuringia. The process started in 2016 with a call for ideas of the Evangelical Church in cooperation with the International Building Exhibition and supported by the cultural foundation of the federal state. We initiated processes on site and locally, and in 2017 we had an exhibition, which I will come back to. We, that is the representatives of the International Building Exhibition in Thuringia in central Germany, and of the Evangelical Church in central Germany, we had an agency which supported us, and we gathered advisors, and of course we had a lot of partners in the church congregations themselves, as well as in the municipalities and in the neighborhoods. The pastors were always present, etc. You can imagine. So upon demand or proactively, we went to the different locations of the churches, and we had small workshops for with calls for ideas. Here you can see one of the examples which then developed in these discussions a mystery church, etc. Every idea was permissible, and we wanted to achieve. We wanted to succeed in people opening their horizons, and this call for ideas led to many activities. This is St. John in Elrich, and you can see here in this bubble people who had a meeting, a listening circle, which, by the way, is a response as well to the energy situation and the temperature in these buildings. So we were cold for a long time, or for a lot of the times. In different spaces, students used these spatial offers and did artistic interventions, small exhibitions, student projects, which were only present for a few days. And ultimately, in 2017, we had an exhibition in a church in Erfurt, in the Kaufmannskirche. 20,000 visitors visited this exhibition, and all the ideas which were proposed, around 500, were presented on these screens. The exhibition took place here. The inauguration, one one part of the exhibition then went to Lutherstadt for the anniversary of the Reformation. The horticultural show had a part of the exhibition. We even sent a part to our colleagues in the Netherlands, in Limburg. The church itself, of course, was a great place for discussion. You can imagine that this topic, of course, also is controversial. There are skeptical people who voiced concerns, others who said we have to be more courageous. Is that allowed? Doesn't that go too far? Please leave the church in the village, which basically is a metaphor for stay grounded. And in 2019, for example, the evangelical church in central Germany was able to get the church building day to come to Erfurt. So a lot of these offers in the churches could be visited. I will show a few examples briefly here. The St. Anne Chapel in Kobitz, where you saw the interior just a few moments ago. A very atmospheric space, this small chapel in this field. And thanks to European funds, we had small interventions. It was more a matter of cleaning up than truly building something, constructing something. We added a floor of rammed clay. We had new wooden pews. And thanks to the subsidies by the Federal Foundation, we were able to have an unusual piece of art by Carsten Nicolai, who truly added vibrations to this room, so that here new artists were able to use this very unusual music instrument and to make music there. The other example would be the Herbergskirche, a hospitable church. Basically, you can understand this concept very well because architects from Leipzig, among others, had an idea but not a location, and the church had a location but no idea. So we matched these two, so that during one summer, the members of the church congregation, the neighbors, the pastor, and young people met up and did a lot, Zumba courses, lessons, etc. And then ultimately they offered a first place to stay for a night for short-term stays, and they did a test run, but they also evaluated it afterwards. And the result was that this the bed itself was moved. It is now below the organ gallery, and since 2018 this can be rented. 2 adults can stay overnight there. It is only open during the season from May to September. Otherwise it's too cold. And there have been more than 500 stays last year, even though we had the corona pandemic. There are other churches along a hiking trail which follow this hiking trail. So there are and there is another church which has been opened, so they can be seen as a project family of these hospitable churches. There are other examples. I will only mention here the Apiary Church in Roldisleben. They share their church space and the church yard with bees, with information, scientific findings, events, pedagogical concepts, pieces of art around the topic of bees. It is very popular, and we have had a lot of press visits and guests. My conclusion is that sadly I cannot show you all the examples. There are truly many examples, but this impulse of the call for ideas initiated a lot of processes in these rural areas, and the examples which I just showed are truly from very small congregations, from small parishes. So what we've done is not, I do not call it reuse, I call it extended use, because all of the churches have remained as sacral spaces. They have been preserved as sacral spaces. They have not been secularized or deconsecrated. So they still serve for normal services, for normal mass and church work. So it is a physical, but especially a mental opening which has taken place here. there are many uses and there are many visitors who otherwise would perhaps not have entered these churches, maybe not this church, who maybe would not even have come to this village if there hadn't been this offer of such an unusual possibility of staying overnight in a church space, which you have to yourself for one night. They animate, and that is the important thing in my view. They do not only animate their own building, but the entire town. I call it hybrid use. And in our expert debate with urban planners, we also call it third spaces. So diverse spaces, which especially in rural areas are fundamental, where the old repertory of school, building, and pub cannot exist or does not exist in the same way. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I will close my presentation.
Zu EDITH WOUTERS, die ich kurz vorstelle.
Okay, I'm now going to present EDITH WOUTERS. EDITH is from Belgium, and she's in charge of the Architectural Center, or rather the Center for Architecture, Urbanity and Landscape, which is a really great combination in Kempen. And against this background, she has built a Kempen lab, which I believe is a workshop. That's something that she has started. It's called Landscape of Churches. And we're going to hear her presentation and then discuss. Thank you, Edith. You have the floor.
Thank you, Marta. I will try to share my screen. So indeed, I'm EDITH WOUTERS. Marta introduced me as being the artistic coordinator of AR-TUR, which is the Center for Architecture, Urbanity and Landscape in the rural Kempen region in the north of Belgium. And AR-TUR is a cultural organization which aims to improve the quality of the built environment. Besides that, I lead a cultural architecture practice, which is called Capacité. And in this regard, I was lucky to coach some organizations already with feasibility studies for the reuse of churches commissioned by Parcum, from which we heard Jan Jaspers before earlier in this symposium. As the last individual speaker in this symposium, in which so much has been said already, I have the difficult task to add an extra layer. But I will try to do that and still try to inspire you. The advantage is that I can refer here and there to what has been said before. We have met in our lab also a few people which have been speaking before in this symposium. So in what follows, I try to formulate 10 practical recommendations, specifically from an architectural and urban design perspective, for specific cases of reuse of church buildings, and 3 recommendations on a higher level for policymakers and the civic society. To gain a good insight in diverse spatial challenges in the region and in close collaboration with the University of Antwerp, AR-TUR developed an atlas of the region called Kempen Atlas, which we presented in 2017 as the base of a wider project for the region. And with that knowledge in mind, AR-TUR started Kempen Lab, which is basically a free cultural space bringing together multiple stakeholders in order to explore new insights for diverse spatial challenges in the region. So bearing in mind the challenge of the future use of around 1,800 parish churches in Flanders and a few hundreds of them in the Kempen, most of them churches in villages, we set up Kempen Lab, Landscape of Churches, together with Professor Sven Sterke from KU Leuven, which we heard earlier. We focused on churches in the countryside. What is it that distinguishes village churches from churches elsewhere? And how do we deal with its specific challenges? We concluded the public activities in the lab with a seminar in the church of the hamlet of Turnhout, in which we, together with the participants in the seminar, formulated recommendations for the reuse of the church in Turnhout in particular, and of churches in a rural context and elsewhere in general. Most of the recommendations I mentioned today arise from that event. The idea of the lab is to have an impact on the mindset of all the stakeholders involved, like cultural heritage actors, designers, church managers, local municipalities, the regional government, and so on, causing a catalyst effect on the quality of multiple regional reuse processes in the future. And this map shows the partners which were involved in the lab and the cases we studied and visited. In what follows, I make a plea for a holistic approach of reuse trajectories. But before I start to name the recommendations, it is important to stress the rural perspective I will be talking about, since the Kempen region in the province of Antwerp is a more dense region than most of Europe's rural regions. For a better understanding, I will guide you through a quick overview of the region's history. Until the 19th century, the region was not well developed due to its sandy and unfertile soils. This map from the 16th century shows the villages with numerous church symbols in a vast plain of sand. A typical village consisted of a village center surrounded by fields and meadowlands, followed by the common grounds. After the Belgian independence in 1830, the Belgian government explores the possibilities of that remote and still unspoiled flat land, bringing large-scale infrastructures in the region like channels, followed by industry and housing. What follows afterwards are agricultural colonies to make the region fertile, evidently accompanied by a church or chapel. As Charlotte Ardouy already explained, the housing policy of the Belgian government after World War II speeds up the urban sprawl in Flanders. A new wave of churches in new housing quarters and hamlets follow, like the modern church in the Parkwijk in the town of Turnhout, where AR-TUR is working, and which you can see here on the image. Until now, the DNA of the Kempen, with its mixture of pre-industrial villages, the 19th century villages which follow the new infrastructures, and the 20th century hamlets, is still visible. It is interesting to consider the dense network of churches these villages entail, a network in which each church could play a role in the future. So a first recommendation resulting from our lab is to take into account the DNA of the region. The reuse of rural churches could be enhanced by considering the landscape of churches and their individual role in a regional perspective. The case location of our research lab was a modern church in a hamlet situated along one of the industrial channels I mentioned earlier. The research of the students of KU Leuven, led by Professor Sven Sterke, was the start of our lab and was followed by exhibitions in some churches in the neighborhood and in the Church of Turnhout. Since not so many examples of reuse of churches in a rural context were already available in Belgium, AR-TUR organized an excursion to some village churches in the nearby province of North Brabant in the Netherlands. We saw different examples of successful and less successful examples, and the less successful often because of lack of expertise in the local community and because of programs which were not appropriate for the buildings. An important second recommendation from our lab is to design a process and not only a project. Especially in a rural context, one has to work on the support base and the feasibility in the nearby and further future. One has to be aware of the risk of not having enough expertise at the table and of management and financial aspects in the future. But let's return to our case in the hamlet of Turnhout. A first reason to choose this location was the fact that the opportunities the church could offer, for instance as a community center, had been neglected in the recent master plan for the hamlet. What is more, the church was not even part of the project definition for the master plan due to resistance of the church board. Besides that, a participation process had been initiated by the municipality, from which in retrospect one can say it had insufficient spatial expertise and links with the master plan. The project is now on hold. A second reason was the fact that the nearby church of the hamlet of St. Joseph, at less than 4 kilometers distance along the same channel, earlier had been part of the Research by Design program of the Project Agency for the Reuse of Churches set up by the Flemish government, while it was now part of a participation process set up by the province in its Resilient Villages policy. Strangely enough, the latter participation program did not refer to the earlier design process, nor do those projects refer to nearby churches, like the one of Turnhout. That is again a waste of energy, time and financial means. reasons enough to start our co-creative research here. Wait, something doesn't seem to go anymore. Our third recommendation, therefore, is this. Always analyze the church in its wider context. What can the church mean for the neighborhood? Who will take care of it in the future? How can the church become a catalyst for the neighborhood? How does it relate to nearby churches? Can it contribute with its surroundings to climate resilience or biodiversity or to the resilience of the village? An outstanding example of how to attract people to think about future scenarios was given by Prinzmetall Architekten, who explained their trajectory for the St. Martinskirche in the German, indeed not so rural Stuttgart, but useful anyway. We also heard Gerald Klaar of Prinzmetall earlier in this seminar. It is interesting that the designers started with a limited budget of €3,000 and knew to realize a breeding ground for the reuse of the building as a church for the youth, and this by exploring the assignment gradually in a sequence of yearly interventions in the church building. A great deal of the budget went to a pile of pallets, which were used for a research by trial and error about which spaces and functions a church for young people should enhance. So gradually, a project definition originated. Besides that, the temporary use created a support base with local residents, policymakers, and potential users. And this is the third recommendation. Create a multi-stakeholder group. Don't limit the stakeholders you involve to the owners, immediate neighbors, and local policymakers, but include experts in design, innovative concepts, cooperatives, juridical, and financial aspects. And recommendation 5, don't separate participation processes and research by design or feasibility study. This has the important advantage that precisely by bringing together both, one creates a fertile soil for a realistic future management situation. In the light of the aforementioned, a particularly interesting example of a successful process involving diverse stakeholders and with a qualitative spatial result is the reuse of the monumental church in Vught in the Netherlands. We have heard about that church again. A village with some 12,000 inhabitants, that is Vught. It was only after a first trajectory had stranded, amongst others because of lack of funds for the designed project, and with the destruction of the church in view, that a group of local entrepreneurs decided to take matters in their own hands. An architectural office was part of the team, and inhabitants were involved in the project. Different scenarios were proposed and discussed about. Participation, design, and a professional approach went hand in hand. Subsidies were granted for the restoration of the building, the commune supported the project, and the support base was used for crowdfunding. This exemplary process is certainly one of the important reasons why the project was so successful both in its ambition and result. The result is a public space in which people can freely enter, with a library, the local museum, social organizations, offices, and meetings rooms. A first floor was added in order to gain some surface, this with a lot of respect for the valuable church space and existing wall paintings. By removing the former walls around the church garden and the addition of some external volumes, which host a brasserie and some public offices, the building opens itself towards the village, and the church can be used as a passage from one side of the village to the other. Recommendation 6. Since not in every case the local team available is as strong as the one in Vught, it is important to engage a process supervisor, an external process supervisor maybe, who can combine expertise like research by design and co-creation to conduct a feasibility study and who can neutralize power struggles. Recommendation 7. A church which is still in service is legally part of the public realm. In villages, the church often is one of the rare spaces of places of public space. They should be cherished and reinforced as public spaces if possible. completely different example now. An example of reuse showing that a heavy program like the one in Vught is not always needed and which might inspire shrinking regions. It is the reuse of the neo-Gothic church of the small village Bossuit in Flanders. After it had been withdrawn from worship in 2008, the local government had investigated some possibilities for restoration and conservation, after which a commission was composed with stakeholders from the local and regional level. The commission invited contemporary artists to propose an artistic transformation of the church. The project repeat of the female British-American artist Ellen Harvey was eventually chosen. The church was stripped and transformed into a controlled ruin. In the new terrazzo floor, the shadow of the church of a nearby village, which was destroyed during World War I, was processed. The enclosed space is used for social and cultural events. This is one of the first successful examples of a more loose approach of reuse in Flanders. But here and there in Flanders, one can even hear discussions now about the removal of complete churches. So, recommendation 8. Before kneeling down for the pressure of heavy real estate developments, keep in mind that a good project and accompanying process make it possible to gather funds, usually. Investigate possible funds. Besides local funding and a mix of finances, in rural context, European subsidies might be available. Also think of alternative funding, like crowdfunding, for instance. And of course, you don't expect differently from an architectural center. What is equally important, be aware that the quality of architecture is like a balancing act. Don't make the program too heavy and choose a good designer. And last but not least, take enough time and create a free space to let ideas grow. Sustainable reuse asks for a process thinking, since imagination is a process and not a moment. So this is the resume of the 10 recommendations for specific reuse trajectories. Maybe I can repeat them again. Take the DNA of the region as an important background. Design a process and not only a project. Consider the church in its wider context. Build a community out of a multi-stakeholder group. Do not separate research by design and participation processes. Engage an external process coach or a neutral process coach. Cherish churches as public spaces. Investigate possible funding. Take care of the spatial and architectural quality. And last but not least, take enough time and keep the process alive. Before I conclude, I still have 3 recommendations for policymakers and the civic society, which surpass the local level of specific church buildings. The first one is create a learning network and a central expertise platform where local stakeholders can find an answer to their questions, a step-by-step plan, possibilities of financing, expertise about research by design and participation processes, expertise about movable and immaterial heritage, etc. The second one, create a toolbox with good examples, not only of realized projects, but also of processes of how good projects originate with technical solutions and instruments. And stimulate processes which enhance the power of imagination by leaving room for processes and unexpected outcomes. I can't conclude better than with the words of Peter Block in his book Community, The Structure of Belonging. The design process itself needs to be an example of the future we are intending to create. The material and built world is a reflection of the connectedness, openness, and curiosity of the group gathered to design the space. Authentic citizen engagement is as important as design expertise. I rest my case, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Ich bedanke mich im Namen von allen Zuhörern und Zuhörerinnen, Edith, für diesen informativen Beitrag.
For this very informative presentation and the great and very clear recommendations. I think it's very helpful And there are a few questions in the chat about where we can find this presentation. I would like to initiate the discussion, and I would like to ask Kerstin Grote for help to maybe introduce comments from the chat. There are there's a lot of overlap, and I don't think it's important whether a church is in a town or in a rural area. The procedural character, the process, the role of architecture and quality of time. I don't want to repeat everything we've heard here. So maybe now it would be helpful if we concentrated on the specific needs of the rural areas where churches are smaller, especially the circle of the active participants, active stakeholders, and those who have to have the energy and the time, which is maybe a little bit more difficult than in a larger city. This would be my begin to the discussion, and I would like to ask Kerstin whether she has gathered the first comments from the chat. Yes. In the chat, there was a lot of enthusiasm about both presentations, and we received an information from Kirsten Menzel. So a lot of comments about how to build these databases where you can find examples. Kerstin Menzel, for example, mentioned the project Sacral Space Transformation by the DFG, and she confirms that in Eastern Europe, this reuse is a greater challenge. Exactly what you described, Marta. And she also mentioned a partial project of this initiative from Leipzig, the theological faculty, where the hybrid use is being examined. Michael Gromotka says he contributes to the question what databases you could use or build. Could we also do this with churchinterior.org? You yourself had this explanation of the 10%. I think you are better posed to describe this. Karen Berkemann says that there is a database, www.regionale Kirchen, which gives an overview over reused and closed and decommissioned churches. And Juliane Hartmann says there is a database, a current database for Switzerland. Then we also have the issue of download, which has already been answered. And maybe as a beginning for the discussion, a question from Michael Gromotka: who is the addressee of these recommendations? Who are they destined? Who do they address? Who can assure that these recommendations are being taken up and realized? Edith, you may answer.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's an interesting one. Now, I think there might be different organizations which could take it up. I think in the first place, for instance, in Belgium, we have Parkum, which we know already. I think they take that role already. Also, they try to find out how to deal with it and how to bring expertise together and bring it to the local municipalities and the local communities. What I also think of, for instance, is the other parties involved. Like, for instance, in Belgium, we have the province of Antwerp, who has resilient villages policies. So they also deal with specific questions about the reuse of churches. And what they now focus on mainly is the participation processes. But they don't, what we then often see, and that is, of course, our architectural focus, is that they have less interest maybe in the first place in the architectural and the spatial qualities of the churches. So I think what we try to do and tell here is you have to combine those things. And I think so maybe there might be different organizations involved which should join hands to make things, to make progress or make things happen. Because what we see is often those processes, and we've heard other examples before in this symposium, processes, it's so important to start the right process from the beginning. So it's really important to have that first contact point, what the Parcum is trying to do, for instance, in Belgium. I suppose it could be useful elsewhere else also, and I suppose other countries have the same policies. We've heard them before. Now, in another addressee maybe could also be the local communes or communities, which at least they can reach out. What we see with AR-TUR is often that you have a top-down approach, but also the bottom-up approach. And I think where they meet together and where the bottom-up can inspire the top-down, there you have the best dynamics, for instance, to let things progress and let things proceed. I don't know whether that's enough for the answer.
Würde gern etwas ergänzen dazu.
I would like to add something from my experience. Maybe it sounds very trivial, but the recommendations are addressed to the people who want to do something. You can imagine that with 2,000 churches in Thuringia, not everywhere everybody stood up and said, I want to find a reuse for my church, of course. That was not the expectation we had. And there were many who were skeptical, who said, no, this is going too far. Others were tired because of many fragmented attempts to renovate the church tower, for example, where they didn't get the funding, a small handicapped pathway, and monument preservation agencies did not agree with that. So they were truly tired of these small steps. But there were always people who wanted to be active. And this is what these are the people who can use these recommendations. And my experience is that this can be a very diverse group. There can be neighbors who are not even part of the church congregation. Often it is the congregation itself, but then also one personality, one driver, like the church council maybe, who can take care of that. For example, with these hospitable church for the overnight stays, there's a person who receives these people personally and chats with them. There are others, architects, whatever, who have the energy, and these are the people who can use these recommendations, because whoever is the first, they will not stay the only ones, and then it can be successful. So it has to be built up in this network, and these recommendations are helpful for that. Okay. I would like to add a few questions. From the Evangelical Church in Central Germany, are there examples for the project trial rooms, Erprobungsräume? I do not know this project. Okay, let's continue. Maybe we can just not answer this question. Kerstin Menzel says that there is a pressure and there are these free spaces, but you cannot forget that it is only successful for a part of these churches. Yes, of course, that is our experience as well. And specifically the question whether there are lists for process monitors who can be recommended. I think it's become very clear how important these processes are. How do you handle that, Marta?
Kann ich leider nicht sagen, da müsste man die Kirche.
Das kommt hier gleich, ja.
Sagen. Ich meine, dass unsere Partner extrem gut vernetzt sind.
Our partners are extremely well networked, and there are many networks and many links, connections to other projects. so they know people in this network. The other question was, well, of course, we can't do that for everybody, but still we try, we still make a start, even if we can't do everything. And you know, in the moment when somebody has an idea and they need help, like a church needs an idea, somebody or a committed person needs a location, or an architect wants to do something, at that point, it's a matching that we try to do as IBA, that we do for a couple of years, and we are quite confident that with the partners that we have, that we take over these responsibilities, and that this can be continued this way via this connection. What's interesting is that this process has started that finds imitators, and we don't have to take on their work because they can do it themselves, because they have been given this idea. I think that's the most important idea, you know, the knowledge that who can do this, who can have this knowledge. I don't know if we need to do that, but we have networks like the Symposium, you know, if you've been listening here, or maybe if you have another look at the presentation afterwards, I think you will have a cornucopia of recommendations. But for example, we also worked with the Chamber of Architects, for example. So there's another connection. Or we did seminars at the University of the Bauhaus in Weimar. So there's so many connections. I believe that's something for everybody. Edith, maybe you would like to say something to this idea, where the recommendations come from?
No, I hope things are not lost in translation, but I understood that it was about process monitoring, and then I would like to refer to what Parkim has done. They have the initiative of a pool of traject coaches for the reuse of churches, and to really support monasteries, owners of churches, parishes, everybody who has a question and who owns or is related to a church. And I'm part of that pool of traject coaches. So it's very interesting to see a first round of trajectories has been more or less finished. We've had some knowledge exchange with those traject coaches also, but it's really interesting to see that there are really different aspects in different phases of a process or of a project. So in certain phases, the focus is much more on for instance, the historical gathering of information, the inventory of historical data, of trying to find participation, but also related always to that architectural spatial quality. I think that's really an interesting initiative which Parkin has been doing, and I think they are now changing it, or a little bit more. There are some lessons learned in order to really gather different expertises in those pools, much more than until now, in order to really see what is the best trajectory we can make. I don't know whether this was an answer to the question, but it's an interesting initiative. Anyway.
Ja, vielleicht ist das auch eine Empfehlung an den Veranstalter.
Maybe this is also a recommendation to the organizer and those who are in charge of that, to use this network and this sharing of experience. This should be continued, this sharing. We know that there are churches that, of course, these projects may take several years or even decades. We know other partners like the Wüstenrot Foundation that have published on this topic. So there are lots of sources, but well, my impression from this conference is that the interest is actually increasing at the moment. Then maybe you could think about whether you just have more resources, and maybe, Kerstin, I believe you will mention this. What are the tasks of a process coach? What do they need to know? What do they need to be able to do, such process coaches? Yes, exactly. Let me pick a couple of questions from the chat. Alexander von Hahn asks, how do you start?
Initiative to save the monument, opting instead for demolition? Und das ist, und eine ähnliche Frage stellt Kerstin.
A similar question by Kerstin Menzel. In my view, there is usually always conflicts, or it can be conflicts between quite committed associations, local actors, and the congregations. How is your perception of the situation? So the question of conflicts. Edith, maybe you would like to answer first, and then I would comment once more.
Yes, indeed. Of course, there are conflicting interests in every trajectory, I think, or possible conflicting interests. We have seen that in the case I showed in Turnhout, where the church board was not far enough in the former trajectory for the master plan. Now, during our lab, by really shaping a kind of confidence, so really step by step, letting the congregation or the parish board really feel that we had some good things in mind, which might be useful for them, we were able to really start a positive trajectory. It often takes time. So I have seen, you have seen in my presentation maybe also that image of what we called the neighborhood engine. It's a working model which we developed in another lab. It was about neighborhood renovation, but actually it applies also to trajectories of reuse of churches. If you want to involve neighborhood, if you want to involve different stakeholders, then it's a matter of really letting that engine turn and turn again. Like sometimes it's the first turn of the engine might be like what in Flanders is like to really let communities think about the church policy plans, which church should be developed, which should be left, which still stay in service. That has been a process which has been going on for some years, and some communities have not been finalizing that yet. Other ones are much more ahead already. What you said, Marta, before is indeed you work with the ones who want to go further, and sometimes indeed what we heard also in the case in Vught, there is one trajectory done and it didn't really work out. You learn from that, you go further, and then nice things can happen. So it's a constant process. You really have people. You need people and process coaches who can monitor it. Also, really still keep the history of the process in mind, which was not the case in the case of St. Joseph, which I mentioned, where the participation process didn't know anything about the earlier design trajectory. Those things should not happen. So at least that should be one thing of process coaches or of a kind of higher organization which follows it up what has been done already and what can be done or should be done in the future.
Ich kann dem total zustimmen. Also
yes, I completely agree. You know, if you have real conflicts that can't be reconciled, then you will not be successful. You can maybe adjourn the process. That's something we have experienced too. In our process, we do not have any examples, or we don't have to facilitate any process where it was really about a demolition. It was never really discussed to demolish the whole church. Maybe this is something typical for the east of Germany. Because of the political situation, many churches really put a lot of energy into actually restoring their churches. And so the political situation was just very different. So I can't talk about demolition processes. But of course, there's always conflicts of interest. We have that in many places. And one of the things we did was the test run for the hospitality church. Nobody said, okay, let's make it a hotel, because this would have been the wrong concept, but let's do something together. What can we do? And let's have a try, and then we'll see what happens afterwards. And in this discussion after this first season, for example, we realized that many congregations, the members actually felt disturbed by this bed in the middle of the church. It was, of course, a sensation for the visitors, but many members of the congregation didn't like this bed in the church. It was really, it was something against the substance of their church, of their congregational life. And yeah, we realized that, and then they found a common space. So our experience from this example is that the cooperation has need of many very different competences. It's just not the great young architects that have great designs, but it's also people from monument protection that watch out for the substance of the church, then church representatives who have a theological background and have their theological perspective, because this hospitality, this overnight stay, this was something which needs to be allowed inside a church. We need a permission for that. And of course, you need a pastor who, for example, in that case, he said, you know, because people said people can't sleep in the church, and he said, you know.
Wir haben im Chat eine ziemlich
Okay. So there is a discussion in the chat on the question of which qualifications do these facilitators, these process coaches, what do they need? What is their qualification and what do they need? What do they have to be able to do? And of course, many various professions say, okay, we can do that, like urban planners, process coaches. Everybody says that they are able to do that, people who are able to have some degree of organizing, but also people who say, you know, what's important is that you speak the language of the people, otherwise you won't be able to do anything. Others say, you know, it can be economists, architects, or maybe politicians, finance, you know, various things. So basically you need a panacea. So you're looking for somebody who has expertise in all fields. So maybe I just repeat what's being said here, but the question by Kate Andrew is, who funds all this thinking and participation? Who pays for all of this? I believe this is a very important point. Who pays for the process?
Und ein zweiter Punkt, den sage ich jetzt
And
auch
a second point, let me add this here. Who is the cooperation partner in the heart of these villages and these small towns to avoid this donut effect? This is the effect that Anna Nagel mentioned Monday evening, that, you know, you don't have anything left in the center of the villages, and then the shops and all public instances, everything disappears from the center, and the church may be the last resort, the last place that is still left in the center of the village. So the only third space, so to say. So what is the cooperation like? That would be another question that might be interesting for the last round of discussion. Yes, it's always about money at the end. It's always about money. You know, who pays for it? Who pays the work that you do?
I can try to answer the question. I can give you the example of the trajectory I coached for the Kruisherenkerk in DOEHLER, where actually the owner of the church, which was a non-profit organization dealing with elderly people's care, they paid in the beginning, enfin, it was from the pool from Parkum. So Parkum was the first point of contact for them. So what Parkum did was make an offer for a few €1,000 to let me, in this case, write a subsidy file for the in between the possibilities for subsidies given by the Agency for Cultural the built heritage, since it was a monument church. Now we immediately saw that the answer would not be in the let's say the focus of the work I had to do in between that subsidy conditions. So what I later did was write another subsidy file with the province of Vlaams-Brabant, who wanted to stimulate, let's say, the thinking about housing developments, mixed housing developments in the center of small towns and cities. So with that, with that subsidy, those combined subsidies, I was able to really make a story for the whole for the church and the surroundings. Now that church in particular was part of a monastery, an empty monastery, so it was not more than evident to really make that open. So what I actually did was pay myself with the subsidies I was able to find. Now there's another thinking which has been done in the work of AR-TUR, or other thinking which is done by, for instance, the KU Leuven, which really do some design research by design on specific cases, which can also help. What AR-TUR does is also take a specific case to think about it and to really make that recommendations, what we also are doing now with a working model for the neighborhood engine, what we also do for the toolbox of village architecture and so on. What we also see, for instance, is the policy of the province of Antwerp, who is now also guiding trajectories for the reuse of churches, be it that indeed with that small nuance that they really focus more on the participation and less on the spatial qualities until now, but that might change in the nearby future. So there are different possibilities, which has to be let's say explored. So I suppose it will be different in different places.
Kann vielleicht einfach ergänzen, ohne das jetzt
I
zu
can
weit.
maybe add to that without going too much into detail. My experience is that the processes, not the project where the builder is responsible, but where the owner is responsible, where you can get subsidies of private foundations or from federal or state urban planning promotion or urban development promotion. These processes who initiate this, they also need these higher processes also need funding. Otherwise, these platforms, these exchanges are difficult to initiate. Foundation like the Herrenhausen Foundation can take care of that. Thank you for that discussion, by the way. In our case, we were able to begin because we were supported by the Kulturbundesstiftung, so the cultural foundation of the state, and they enabled this with and then we had these first examples, and then we saw that we could continue. So this has truly been helpful.
Ja.
Okay, Kerstin, the last 10 minutes are for you. So we have more and more voices saying that an exchange, a symposium for the exchange for multi-talented process monitors would be helpful. So the question, how do we continue from here? I agree completely. I would participate there. So groups are finding each other here. And Kerstin Menzel writes something again, and she references the work by Christina Lilie and Mrs. Langner, who we've heard yesterday about Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, the region in Germany. And she says that some reuses redefine the space as a public space, a community center, a neighborhood center, etc. And Daniel Tellman asks, what is the experience of the panelists?
Which led to secularization, desecularization due to the reuse.
With the desecularization. I can give a quick answer. No secularization, no deconsecration, no profanation. For now. I cannot exclude this forever, but in our process, this did not play a role. Edith, do you want to?
I wouldn't know. No.
Matthias Ludwig sagt Kirche und Kommune und
Matthias Ludwig says church and community under one roof. There are many examples for that. Let's wait what happens after the corona pandemic. No restaurants, no pubs, closed churches. Maybe there are also other perspectives for the West. Yes, I can imagine, because with the smaller number of churches with active members, of course, people who have a different connection to the church building from the architectural or structural standpoint, these are very important. So these extended uses then come into play, that churches are used as concert halls for NDR cultural summer here, or for the small choir from the neighborhood. I think that is clear, that is natural, that is basically the starting point for us. So the fact that the church congregation opens up to the municipal or political cultural space, and this is, I think, an answer to the question from before, which I found very interesting. How do we avoid this donut effect? This is where the churches, who are often at a central location, I think they play a very big role, and that is my experience as well, which I think we cannot go more into detail. It's not just a question of the church space, but it's always a agricultural or architectural connection via the forecourt. For example, the apiary church leads into a sort of village landscape with a broader space, an open space, where the trees were planted, a cultural project by other neighbors. So they are very different public spaces that have evolved. I am taking a look at the watch, and Kerstin, if you agree, then I would I would say we wouldn't look at the chat again, and maybe we can speak about what kind of continuation we can have here. Multi-talents, financing, funding, who can pick up on the recommendations which we heard from Edith. So there are a lot of things which can be discussed further, and I think this platform, this character as a platform is a very good occasion or opportunity for this. The question which also came up, what is the difference between urban and rural spaces or situations? We did not answer that. I think people are similar in both contexts, but because we don't only have farmers in the villages, I think it's the same in Flanders. But I think that what is special about this work, which we did in these small parishes, is that it's always very specific, always very individual and personal. You were not able to blend it to the background, to blend it to a group. It was always discussed personally, which is also a guarantee for success. So that is maybe what I want to use as a conclusion. Edith, maybe do you want to add something as a conclusion, as a final remark? And then Kerstin, I thank you for your work, and of course for everybody who worked in the background.
Edith?
Yes, if it's still about the question about urban and the rural context, I think in Flanders we have the problem, I think, of the financing and the carrying capacity of the rural municipalities. We a little bit unlike in the Netherlands, for instance. I know that for instance, there are the bigger cities with a lot of villages. I think that's mainly the thing there. In Flanders, we do have a lot of small autonomous municipalities who don't really have the carrying capacity to really have all that expertise in the house. We see that also in the urban development of the villages also, that we really need to think in a more regional level to really support them. So there it's really important to bring in the extra expertise which is not there on the local level. So I think there might be the challenge for the rural communities to really open their minds and attract the right experts with their trajectories.
Ich würde jetzt gerne am Ende.
I would like to then give you some information as a conclusion. We have an exhibition on the website under the tab Exhibitions, which has been organized by the Wüstenrot Foundation, and we all heard the deputy leader of this foundation, Mr. Krämer, who was responsible for this exhibition. These are great examples for an extended use of church buildings in the whole of Germany. And this exhibition will remain on the website and can also be ordered at the Wüstenrot Foundation. This is how I would like to conclude these remarks. And I don't think it's a problem if we end the session 2 minutes early instead of 2 minutes late. Thank you to both speakers in this final session, which does not mean that the topic of church reuse in the rural area is last in our focus, but we see all these topics as equal. So this would be my conclusion. Let's take a short break to breathe for a few minutes. That's what I would prefer.